Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble.
And I'm Chris Clements.
And we are honored once again.
My gosh, a trifecta. Another trifecta for us, Sean. Can you believe this?
That's awesome. We have John Desser.
Friend John David Desser just flew in a day ago from Israel.
Yeah.
Which he can talk to us a little about that. But he is coming direct from the Washington Hilton in our nation's capital, where the first Thursday every year, this strange thing takes place called the National Prayer Breakfast. And it's now like transformed itself kind of back to the way it used to be, with all the members meeting for the prayer breakfast on the Capitol. Is that right, John?
Yes.
And then now they have an international lunch up at the Hilton, which is starring the Queen of Jordan today.
She's the speaker today.
She is the speaker today. And John is good enough to hang out with us for like 15 minutes while the Queen of Jordan, she's downstairs.
So you've got to be jet lagged. Or do you just, are you so used to this international travel that it just doesn't bother you? You're like an international man of mystery.
That, I think I'm just running on fumes. I'm fine.
Well, and it's important to discuss just briefly about why John is in Israel. Is that his 95-year-old father just passed away quite suddenly, and he was down in Nashville attending a small concert for his daughter, who's an amazing artist, amazing singer, and then had come back to D.C. and got the call that his dad had passed away the day after his 95th birthday.
That's amazing.
And John and I grew up together in Tucson, Arizona, and went to St. Gregory High School. And he's been on the show 3 times now, and appreciate him calling in and giving us a little color, not only on maybe his dad's life a little bit, but also this thing called the National Prayer Breakfast, which I've been honored enough to have been to a couple times.
Well, and John, there's probably there is a unique nature. You are unique.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons, but you're one of the nicest guys in the world on the Hill,
which is a rarity.
A nice lobbyist, but you also are a messianic Jew. Is that the right way to say it?
That's correct. That is correct.
And so that's interesting to Christians like us, and I guess I don't know this about your dad. Was he the same or different?
No, so thanks for asking. It's great to see you guys again. I'll try to do the real short version here. My dad grew up in an Orthodox home. He was ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, and then he left Orthodox Judaism for about 40 years, which happened to be my growing up years. Mm-hmm. So I was raised in a secular Jewish home. We didn't talk much about faith. But when I moved to Washington, D.C. in 1990 and started working for Senator John McCain, I started getting invited to a little breakfast group that met on Capitol Hill. Well, it turned out it was a prayer breakfast group. I didn't know that at the time, or I probably wouldn't have gone. But I found it quite intriguing, and I kept going. And over time, I started going to the National Prayer Breakfast, which, as you mentioned, I'm here for again today at the Washington Hilton on Connecticut Avenue. I think this is my 30th National Prayer Breakfast.
Wow.
And after attending a few of these, I started to really think about why were these really intelligent people who I admired talking about their faith so eloquently and so passionately. And it made me a little bit jealous. It actually says in the scripture, it says that the Gentiles will make the Jews jealous because of their relationship with God. I think Paul wrote about that in one of the epistles. And I think that was kind of happening to me. I saw that they had a genuine relationship with the Creator that I didn't have. And so I started reading the Bible, starting in Genesis, all the way through to the New Testament, and I became convinced that Jesus, or Yeshua, as his name is said in Hebrew, was the promised Messiah of the Jewish people, and that he was likely to come again, but in fact, the Messiah that the Jews are waiting for had been here already once, and was the same guy all the Christians were running after. That's kind of how I saw it in my economy. I saw it from a very Jewish perspective, that
Right.
Messiah was promised to the Jewish people. He came, he's coming again. And right about that time, not long after that, my father also had a spiritual reawakening, but returned to Orthodox Judaism, and with that moved to Israel. So for the last 23 years or so, he's lived in Israel. He got remarried in an arranged marriage, And he spent all of his days, all of his waking hours, learning Torah and Talmud and studying at a very orthodox kollel, which is like a yeshiva, a school for married men who are older but are really investing in their learning, because learning in the Jewish world is a lifelong thing.
Right.
You don't stop learning at some point. And my father was very passionate about going to learn and study the scriptures every day for the last 20 some years. And so when I'd returned from this side trip to Nashville and heard that my father had passed, I jumped on a plane and was able to make it to his funeral. And then I sat in mourning for 7 days, which is the Jewish tradition. You sit Shiva, you sit in mourning, and you don't leave the house, you don't work, you just sit. And people come visit you and pay their respects and tell stories about the deceased and say nice things about them, that sort of thing. So that's what I returned from yesterday morning. And then in the evening, I had to come back down into D.C. for the opening dinner of the prayer breakfast, which was held this morning. And as Chris mentioned, now is the leadership luncheon, which is being held right now as we speak. And Queen Noria, the Queen of Jordan, is the Queen Rania, excuse me, Queen Rania, Noor was the mom, was
Yes.
King Hussein's
I get
wife.
them mixed up too.
And Queen Rania is King Abdullah's wife. She's speaking right now. King Abdullah spoke to us this morning.
Interesting. Wow.
That's quite the tour of our great world.
Yeah, this morning was great. As you mentioned, Chris, the prayer breakfast was started back in the 40s. It started with President Eisenhower. There was a senator from Kansas named Frank Carlson who felt like the problems of the world were so great that it required prayer. So he started a little group in the Senate. And Eisenhower, who was also from Kansas, called Carlson one night from the White House and said, "Frank, this is the loneliest place I've ever lived." And Carlson said, "Well, we have this little prayer group that meets on Wednesdays, whatever day it was." And he said, or Thursdays, he said, "Why don't you come join us?" And so Eisenhower came and went to this Senate prayer meeting. And when the members of the House of Representatives found out about that, they said, "Well, we want to meet with the president and pray with him also." And so then they got both the House and Senate groups together. Eisenhower came back, and that was the first national prayer breakfast. I think that was 1943 or something like that.
Wow.
1953.
53.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Now,
And it's been going ever since.
Yeah, and everything used to be held up there at the Hilton. It used to be, I mean, a lot of it, it's gone through different permutations over time, and a lot of it, there's a lot of politicking going on. There's a lot of, it is a place to be seen in some regards, but then there's a lot of really amazing meetings happening around the prayer breakfast within the building by faith leaders from all over the world, just getting together to pray about and to congregate on how to solve some of the world's most pressing problems. So
Right.
it's a pretty dynamic environment. It can be a little overwhelming when, especially your first time. My first time going to the prayer breakfast, I think John invited me to be an usher, and that had to do with just ushers meetings and making sure people got seated where they needed to be seated. And then several years ago, my wife and I went to President Obama's last prayer breakfast. Mm-hmm. And that was dramatic. That was pretty incredible. Most people who had been to all the prayer breakfasts that he had hosted said that it was his most open, most revealing in terms of his speech. So, and now it's kind of gone back to John, to less of the showpiece, and more of the leaders and members of Congress meeting in the morning in the Capitol, and these other elements are still happening, but they're happening later. Is that correct?
Yeah. So during COVID, they didn't meet for, I think it was 2 or 3 years, and it was sort of a Zoom meeting with recorded videos. It was what you could do during COVID.
Sure.
And then last year, they decided to come together for the first time in person, but to do it at the U.S. Capitol, and only members of Congress and the president. So yes, this kind of went back to its original intent of members of Congress meeting together in prayer and lifting up the president and him joining them. And so that's what they did last year, and that's what they did this morning. Except this year, we also invited business leaders, state leaders, friends from other countries to come back to the Washington Hilton. And we had our own event here at the Washington Hilton, hosted by two former members of Congress who were active in the House Prayer Group. And they invited King Abdullah of Jordan to give remarks. And then when President Biden was speaking to the members of Congress at the Capitol this morning, they had that piped in through video in our room, in the ballroom at the Hilton. And also President Zelensky of Ukraine joined via video, both at the U.S. Capitol and here at the Hilton.
Wow. Go.
How would you characterize the spirit with that sort of dynamic now? You think is the spirit the same?
New ground. No, it's new ground. You know, it's for instance, you know, we'd normally see somewhere between 80 and 110, 20 members of Congress come to the Hilton for the prayer breakfast.
Sure.
The first Thursday in February. And that's a pretty good turnout. But today, because it was in the U.S. Capitol, they had 240 members of Congress at the prayer breakfast. And that's more than half.
Yeah.
And
so that's a pretty good turnout. And
that was more the spirit of the prayer breakfast, really. I mean, even people who are not, they're believers, but they're might be even jaded by going up to the Hilton and you know, being part of this kind of production.
Right. And it's so much easier to get to by having it in the U.S. Capitol.
Sure.
So, you know, I wasn't there in the U.S. Capitol this morning, so I don't know what the spirit was like, but I'm guessing from what I've heard from last year's, it was a very nice, intimate setting with only members and the president there. And then we did get a sense for what was happening in the room because we were able to watch President Biden's remarks and President Zelensky's remarks. You know, but I did hear from a few friends from other countries why it's a challenge for members of parliament to come if they're not going to be in the same room with the president, with the members of Congress. So we were brainstorming about maybe other things we can do to, you know, to recreate that connection that members of Congress were having with members of parliament from other countries, because it was very inspiring for some of these other parliamentarians to be at the prayer breakfast and then maybe go home and host something similar in their capitals.
And the spirit, I mean, just to characterize it, is not one of, you know, some people would try to characterize it as one of organized religion. It's not that. It's meeting the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, one of the things the prayer breakfast has been very careful about is because they want it to be a welcoming environment for any person, not just any elected official, but any person, is to not have it associated with any specific religion. And so they don't want it to be thought of as a Christian prayer breakfast.
Gotcha.
Even though it really is. They don't call it that because they don't want someone who happens to be agnostic or atheistic or of Jewish background, or, you know, someone from the Middle East with a Muslim background. They don't want them to feel uninvited. So they don't call it a Christian event. They call it an event in the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth. They don't even say Spirit of Jesus Christ, because you may not have concluded yet that he's the Christ, but they still want you to feel welcome and come and learn about him and his teachings and his life. And they believe the Holy Spirit will be the person that reveals to someone whether or not he also was the Christ. But we can at least just introduce people to the person of Jesus and his teachings, and then let the Holy Spirit do the rest of the work. That's kind of been the theory behind the prayer breakfast for the last few decades. And honestly, I got to kind of say it worked for me. I wouldn't have come to a breakfast on Capitol Hill if I knew I was being invited to a Christian breakfast, because I wasn't a Christian at that time.
Yeah.
And so instead, nobody told me anything about it. And all of a sudden it got quiet and somebody pulled a little book from their breast pocket and started reading from it. And I thought, that sounds like it could be the Bible. And it turned out it was. So I was a little annoyed that no one warned me. But at the same time, I also knew myself well enough to know that if I had known, I probably wouldn't have gone. And so I kept attending that week after week because there were some very interesting messages and thoughts being shared, and I was intrigued by it.
It's fascinating how little things have big impact on the course of our life. So,
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, and
I would say for John and I both, I mean, being in D.C., living there during that, during our formative years and being exposed to some great people of faith and great brothers of faith that really helped put us on a path that I don't think we would have been on, even with all the struggles that we've had and all the ups and downs of our life, that anchor, I think that those experiences provided us at that time. I mean, being an usher at the National Prayer Breakfast, being part of, a fellowship of friends there that help put it on, but also keep connected, through our lives, even though distance and time may separate us. It's an interesting spirit there, regardless of time and space.
yeah.
yeah, Sean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that some wonderful relationships have been forged, beginning with people meeting each other at the National Prayer Breakfast, across partisan divides, across philosophical divides, across foreign borders. I know of one example where two foreign leaders who were literally at war with each other did some follow-up meetings after the prayer breakfast at the Cedars, which is an estate that the prayer breakfast sort of helps facilitate and host, and they ended a war because they decided they should really think about this idea of loving your neighbor in their roles as head of state of their country. And so, it's not an exaggeration to say lives have been saved and wars stopped and people fed. We heard from David Beasley last night, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts leading the UN World Food Program. And he said a lot of the way I got extra help at the UN World Food Program was from donations from countries who were being led by leaders who I had met at the National Prayer Breakfast, and they were inspired to help care for the poor and to give more money than they ever previously had to trying to defeat hunger. And so that was another wonderful testimony of relationships being forged at the breakfast, which then produce good works, and in this case, preventing starvation and helping people who don't know where their next meal's coming from.
Wow.
It's a pretty dramatic and dynamic place.
Yeah. Well, John,
That's why David Beasley couldn't do that. I thought he was still in Syria, but no, he was hanging out with John Desser. Of course.
Well, John,
Because he got back to me, but he said,
Yeah.
I'm busy. I'm like, why?
yeah, I understand. He's a busy guy.
he's a busy
He's feeding the world. John, thank you especially for taking the time, both at the tail end of your trip back from your father's funeral and in the middle of the prayer breakfast, to give us some additional sight on faith. It's one of the pillars of our podcast. It's always good to have John because he really is the embodiment of faith, freedom, and free enterprise.
Yes. He's our beacon, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, John Desser is the beacon of faith, freedom, free enterprise. No, he's my best friend, and we're such good friends because we've had this push-pull on each other for the last 40 years. And there's been times when he's had to slap me across the head and be like, what are you thinking? And I've had to do the same. And that's real, having real faith in one another, number one. Sure. And understanding that we can be better than we think we are. And having a brother that you can walk with through life. And he was there when my father passed away. He was actually supposed to go to Israel. And I called him. He reminded me of this the other day. He was supposed to go to Israel. This is in February 1995. And I called him and I said, hey, John, I think you need to postpone your trip to Israel because my father he's dying. And if you could make it to Tucson, I think that would be great. And he was on the next flight out. And when he went in to see my dad, and I said to my dad, hey, Dad, it's John's here. He's here to see you. And my dad remembered. He goes, John's in Israel. He can't be here. But we were there for each other at that time. And we've been there for each other, these 30 years hence.
It's awesome.
And I wish I was there with you. Whenever we talk about the
ride.
prayer breakfast, I'm like, why didn't I go this year?
Yeah.
I don't know why.
We did this last
Oh
time.
yeah, I got things to do. I've got little kids. I can't do that as much anymore.
Right.
Well, always good to see you guys, and great job on the show. I think it's growing, and people are listening and watching, and you guys have a lot of insight and interesting things to say about current events and things that are happening because of your unique perspectives from business and politics. And I wish you guys nothing but success and a lot of growth and in your following.
Well,
Great.
thanks, John.
Well, thank you, John, so much.
And say hi to all the brothers out there. And God
I'll
bless.
say hi to all your friends.
All right.
All right, take care.
Thanks, John.
Take care, guys.
Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.